stand. We come to the Department of Music. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Richard Schmitt from the School of Social Work here at Wayne State University. And his topic today is, can recruiting immigrants repopulate the urban core? Spatial assimilation or reproduction of gentrification. So we want to welcome him, Dr. Richard Schmitt.
Thank you. My co-authors really wanted to be here. They are both doctoral candidates, and so they are busy working on their dissertations and other things. So I will carry on. That's better. I wanted to make sure you could see Wayne State. So I'll be talking about the relationship of gentrification and spatial assimilation. And as is the case in academic talks, I'll kind of briefly discuss the literature, then the methods, then the results, and then we can talk a little. So why am I doing this? Other presenters have discussed some of the political and policy movements abound to save the inner city. We've heard earlier in the previous session in the other room about the creative class. Richard Florida, his whole philosophy of the creative class is that a concentration of engineers, design professionals, and other creative professionals are essential for economic growth. And he uses as a measure of creative regions immigration. Governor Granholm had institutionalized this in the Cool Cities program as a way of marking city neighborhoods as cool. And now Governor Snyder has also taken this on. He has an Office of New Americans that is working to promote immigrant integration in the state of Michigan. And the idea here is that, whether you're talking about an inner city or a region or a state, if you have problems with economic growth, that immigrations can be part of that solution. So this is motivated, is this a realistic assumption? I was really having trouble articulating this, and the great thing about Wayne State University, we have doctoral students, and I was able to hire excellent doctoral students to talk with me about this. They both introduced me to the literature on spatial assimilation. We talk a lot about gentrification. I think it was part of every panel. We don't talk enough about spatial assimilation. I'll get into both of those. But the part you probably are familiar with is the narrative of urban decline. Why do cities decline? Well, cities, just in a broad brush sweep, they start out small and compact. They grow outward. The housing stock in the middle gets old. It deteriorates. People with means don't want to live in old, deteriorating housing stock. They move outward. We have white flight, suburbanization. Hopefully you'll stay for William Julius Wilson's presentation. He is one of the classic articles exploring how jobs left the inner city, creating concentrations of poverty. And that there's also then segregation. We've had people present on segregation and hypersegregation. That is to say, some neighborhoods are of one racial or ethnic group or class group, and others are not. So, it seems odd. It's almost why would gentrification happen? This is just against the current. Why would people with means come back to the city? And nonetheless, in the 70s, people started writing about the Back to the City movement, in particular in New York and London. And this emerging literature of gentrification came out. What is gentrification? It's the replacement of low-income residents with people with higher incomes, higher occupational status. It also includes changes to the built environment. So that older housing stock can be renovated or it can be demolished and replaced with newer housing stock. Gentrification is often thought of as a racialized phenomenon, but the scholars who study this are careful to distinguish that it doesn't have to be racialized. African Americans can be gentrifiers. So there's a classic article on that. And gentrification, there are people in this city who see it as a hopeful sign. There are people who see it as actually something quite evil. There are scholars who do see that there are benefits to gentrification in that, yes, if there is a tax base, those taxes can support services that help low-income families. I didn't include up here, but that there also is a problem that, what's worse than gentrification is being stuck in place in a neighborhood you don't want to live. But the counterpoint to gentrification that we often miss in these discussions is that of spatial assimilation. And if you think of this nation as a nation of immigrants, and not everyone in the United States is an immigrant, but for the purpose of this paper, if you imagine urban areas and classic ethnic enclaves, immigrant groups came together through this phenomenon of reactive solidarity. Often they were not allowed to live in other neighborhoods, and they were not allowed to patronize certain businesses. This was both voluntary and involuntary immigrants. And so this created a set of housing dynamics, business dynamics. You have ethnic enclaves, neighborhoods that get marked with a certain race or ethnicity. Chinatown, Mexican town, German town, Hamtramck, you can picture different ethnic enclaves. However, just as an individual immigrant can assimilate into a mainstream culture, and what the assimilation process is that one adopts the language and culture of the receiving country. So if you are from Cuba, you learn English. Maybe you keep certain aspects of your home culture, but you assimilate and are able to function in the new society, new economy. Well, Massey and Denton extended this idea to urban spatial structure. So neighborhoods, households and families in neighborhoods can experience spatial assimilation, which is to say that whole, it's the opposite of the ethnic enclave. Instead of seeking, living with people like yourself, you actually want to live in the mainstream. And so in the literature that's defined, that is racialized. It's white middle class. So you seek neighborhoods that are English speaking, white, and middle class. And that's your dream neighborhood. You don't want to live in the city anymore. Now this is not just, as I said earlier, it's voluntary, involuntary immigrants, also native-born people of color. So people, several generations in the city. So also African Americans, Latinos, can also go through the spatial assimilation process. And so this comes in question. So what's the relationship? You have one force, the desire to be mainstream and live in a nice neighborhood, that drives people out of the inner city. And yet, you have some policymakers pursuing efforts to encourage gentrification. of the native born or of immigrants. And that seems to be going in the opposite direction of the main force of urban change. And so we thought, you know, as the three of us had our conversations about this paper. So if you imagine, on the one hand, with spatial assimilation, that leaves housing stock in the inner city, and who's going to take that? And then at the same time, you have more immigrants and people of color living in predominantly white middle-class neighborhoods. So white middle-class kids are exposed to living with people of color, immigrants, people who speak different languages. And so maybe that reduces the social distance, and then over time, gentrification doesn't seem like such a bad idea. So that's the idea. So I just boiled it down to two simple questions. Is there a relationship, an association between spatial assimilation and gentrification at the metropolitan level? So do metropolitan areas like Metro Detroit, Metro Chicago, if they've got high levels of spatial assimilation, do you see high levels of gentrification? Or vice versa? And secondly, have we seen in the past, do gentrifying neighborhoods pull in immigrants? In other words, is there a causal effect of a gentrifying neighborhood on the immigrant population in that neighborhood? And I also, also looked at percent African American, percent white, percent Hispanic, and percent Asian. All right, so methodology. So my data is from the National Neighborhood Change Database. A company called Geolytics has worked with Urban Institute. They take the census data and then just make sure that every neighborhood is coded the same over a 5-decade span. Now, normally when the census comes out, they create a different census map each decade and create a new set of neighborhoods. They're not that different each decade, but there are differences. So if you want to compare neighborhoods over time, you need to make sure that the boundaries are the same. This creates problems, as you might imagine, because there were a lot of neighborhoods that weren't here in 1970. Another thing, what are the metropolitan areas in the United States? That's changed over time. A metropolitan area is this entity that the White House says is the place where people live and work. And there's a lot of places, I'm not sure, the number of these places has gotten really big over time. And just remember that as a possible limitation. So there's about 366 today. And the neighborhoods within, the census calls these census tracts. These aren't necessarily neighborhoods that you would think of as a neighborhood. They're just used to collect census data, and that's what we use. So there's about 60,000 of those in my sample. I'm using standard panel data methods. Well, not too standard. I'm using a negative binomial count data method. I looked at gentrification each decade, so from 70 to 80, 80 to 90, 90 to 2000, 2000 to 2010. I won't go over every table, so you don't have to leave for coffee just yet. And then to figure out the difference, so are these gentrifying neighborhoods, are they bringing in more immigrants or not? That's just a t-test, but I matched the gentrifying tracts to non-gentrifying tracts using propensity score matching. Well, that was my big surprise, so pretend you didn't see that. So what metro area is the hotbed for having the highest rates of gentrification in 2010? You'll never guess. Anyone want to guess?
New York.
Was it Napa?
Napa! Napa, California has been gentrified. And you're thinking, you're starting to scratch your head. Auburn, Alabama, Amarillo, Texas, Fayetteville, North Carolina, Carson City, Nevada. Flagstaff is on the list. Rapid City, South Dakota. Why Rapid City, South Dakota? I have no idea actually, but this is kind of odd. What's going on here? This is the rate of gentrification. So it's the number of gentrifying tracts divided by the number of tracts in the region. So if you have a smaller region, even when one or two neighborhoods gentrify, it's a large proportion of the tracts. So, are you with me?
Yes.
You're looking very skeptical. All right. Now,
Take it in there.
so if you don't divide by the total number of tracts, then you get the list that was in your head. New York, LA, Chicago, Philadelphia, Miami, Detroit, Phoenix, Houston, San Francisco. That's probably the list you thought you'd be seeing. So these are the metro areas with the highest number of gentrifying tracts in 2010. All right. Correlation table. The only thing I wanted to point out, and I don't have a laser pointer, G is for gentrification, S is for spatial assimilation, then you've got the decade. These aren't high. So a high correlation would be like 1. 1 is the highest. So you're usually looking for 80 or 90%. But I wanted to show how, as you go back in time, see if I can see an example. The correlations, say, between the higher correlations are further back in time. So there's a little bit of a lagged effect, if at all. But this graph probably says it all. The top, can you guess which one is gentrification? Is it the top or the bottom? By the way, this is decades, 80, 90, 2000, 2010. And then higher means higher gentrification or spatial assimilation, lower means lower. Can you guess which graph is gentrification and which is spatial assimilation? Which one?
What is gentrification?
Good guess, but no. It's gentrification, skyrocketing. Spatial assimilation is pretty much tapered off. So here's Detroit, and it's right here is the current decade. All the red are gentrifying neighborhoods. See how in the 80s, there wasn't a single gentrifying neighborhood in Detroit, and then there was like 3 in the 90s. See how much it's changed. Here's Napa, and you can see this is current, pretty much the whole center of the city is gentrified. Chicago, blue is spatial assimilation, by the way. And I wanted to show this. You know, we talk about gentrification. Look at all the neighborhoods that have become, slightly less white. And Boston, 80 and then 2010. But what's the overall trend? Oh wait, that was back here, sorry. So gentrification is increasing about 30% a decade. There's a relationship, it's not very big. It's 1.003. So for every additional tract that is experiencing spatial assimilation, it's about a 0.003 factor increase in gentrifying tracts. Not much, but you can see part of it's because there's a tapering off. Now the second half, is this really pulling in immigrants? No, it's actually pushing out immigrants. So there's still probably spatial assimilation, the arrow going in the other direction. No significant change this decade in the percent black or white in gentrifying neighborhoods. Slight uptick in percent Asian, slight downtick in percent Hispanic, and that probably overlaps quite a bit with foreign born. So immigrants are still leaving the inner city. it's going to be very tough for Governor Snyder to convince immigrants otherwise. Gentrification, by definition, primarily a class issue. Since we saw that tapering off, maybe we're reaching the limits of spatial assimilation. And yeah, just close with thoughts. There are normative debates about gentrification, and to me that really has to do about the rights of capital on one hand and the right to the city on the other. We've had great discussions already on the right to the city, and we need to engage that. Like, I haven't seen a single public official, at least in Michigan, talk about the right to the city in any productive way. And I think we need to help them have that conversation. And also bring in, you know, the idea that there's a strong desire for spatial assimilation still of African Americans, of immigrants, and, you know, it somehow would seem wrong to say you shouldn't do that. And we can't have that conversation. We aren't having that conversation productively yet, and I think we should. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. We have some time for some questions. So,
From the civil engineers, Detroit's infrastructure tax base, so we need to recruit 100, 200,000
Yeah.
people minimally. Is more likely those people are going to come from other countries in the suburbs, combined with educational wise, that we need engineers, highly educated people. It's easier to get them from the Far East where they have large amounts of population, large amounts of engineers in the suburbs. So we'll actually be immigrants or maybe from the Far East, the
Yeah.
Middle East, that are going to gentrify the cities to supply the population that we need.
I think that there are what's the word? There are strategic alliances that have been delivering this message. The tech industry has invested in this message, and Governor Snyder is part of the tech industry. He is heavily invested in tech, career-wise, and that is the message coming from the tech industry. That there's debate on whether that's either realistic or even necessary. And I think it's important to have that debate. You know, could we train engineers who are native born? And what would we have to do that? I tend to be, for whatever reason, I have a pro-immigrant bias, so I'm not uncomfortable with opening up tech visas, for example. But we should be, you know, investing in our public school system, you know, like that's, we should be doing that too. But I don't think it's, no one's really thought, say we opened up 200,000 tech visas, say 100,000 came to Metro Detroit, what would we do with this influx of 100,000 highly skilled immigrants? Like, that would take more planning than what is currently happening. Yeah.
I had kind of a two-part question. One is just a little bit informational. How did you mark a gentrifying census
Oh,
tract so that I
good.
didn't either miss that or I didn't?
I didn't go into that. So first, in the previous decade, so if I was looking at gentrification in 1980, first I'd look at the neighborhood in 1970.
Okay.
And so that neighborhood would have to have, be below the 40th percentile in median income. And then it had to be in a center city. So what's happened this decade, the White House made a list of center cities in 1982, and they did nothing with that list until 2009, and they tripled the list. So that's why now Southfield is considered a center city. Whereas before, the only center city was Detroit and Pontiac in the metro area. And if you include, well, let's see, Washtenaw County is not included, that Washtenaw is in its own So then in the second decade, you look to see if the income in the tract has increased, the home values have increased, the rent has increased, and that the age of the housing stock has gone down. In other words, that so there's been new construction, and all of those have to have happened. Yeah, and so it's a pretty rare phenomenon. About 1 to 2% of neighborhoods in the country gentrifying on a given decade, but that's increasing. You can make up your own definition if you want. Yeah.
The question that keeps reoccurring to me is that they talk about bringing in all these people from Asia, from other places, but how long are these people going to stay given the plight of the city and the plight of our education system, which has not been addressed at all? And obviously you're going to need these people to stay around for a while before you're going to have the taxes to address the education problem.
Right, so that won't happen until the education. I would agree that it will not be an attractive place to live for families with the schools in their current condition. And I think from the governor's position, he's interested in bringing the immigrants into the state as a whole. Global Detroit would like immigrants to be in the city of Detroit, but realistically they work with suburban communities because that's where immigrants go.
And then that was the second part of my question, is it a particular class or education background of immigrant, or is it, so in your research, is immigrant coded as a highly educated, high-skilled immigrant, or?
So when I showed that there's a 1% decline, that was anyone who was born abroad,
Okay.
of foreign birth. There's ways to disentangle some of those different levels, which I haven't had time to get into. And then spatial assimilation is about the character of the whole neighborhood. And so, yes, that neighborhood's character, middle class, of a higher income. But this study, I did not look at the individual characteristics, but there are studies that have.
Do you have an end user? Are you sort of, in terms of your research, presenting it in sort of Scotland Journal or
Yeah, so
articles, or?
what were we thinking? There's a journal called City and Community. Sociologists probably know it. And I have a relationship with Global Detroit. We have some of our graduates who work there. We have conversations, but the policy levers here are unclear and difficult to move. When you start talking about immigration. So I think Global Detroit, they've had success with foundation support, but that's more supporting what's happening. The big policy lever, of course, is immigration reform, and that is stalemated. I don't want to say more to that.
One more question?